The hollow signal. The radio had been silent for weeks, not the usual static-laden silence that hissed through the old cabin like a distant storm, but a deep, unnatural absence of sound that seemed to swallow even the air itself. Mara had noticed it on the first night after the power went out, how the ancient AM/FM set on the kitchen counter refused to hum, even when she twisted the dials until her fingers ached. She chalked it up to the blizzard at first. The snow had buried the cabin up to its windows, cutting her off from the world beyond the pines. No cell signal, no internet, no neighbors for miles. Just her, the creaking walls, and the endless white. But it wasn't the storm. She knew that now. It started with the footsteps, soft at first, barely audible over the wind. A faint crunch, crunch, crunch circling the cabin in the dead of night. She'd stumbled to the window, breath fogging the glass, and squinted into the dark. Nothing. Just snowdrifts and the skeletal outlines of trees bending under the weight of the storm. She told herself it was a deer, maybe a wolf, scavenging in the frozen waste. But the prints she found the next morning weren't hooves or paws. They were bare human feet, deep and deliberate, circling the cabin in a perfect ring. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. Just a loop like someone or something had walked endlessly around her sanctuary until dawn. Mara tried the radio again that day. She cranked the battery handle until her arms burned, desperate for a voice, a signal, anything to break the isolation. Nothing came, not even static. Just that hollow silence, pressing against her eardrums like water at the bottom of a well. She left it on anyway, its blank speaker facing her like an unblinking eye as she boiled snow for drinking water and rationed the last of her canned soup. The second night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, closer, as if whatever was out there had grown bolder. She barred the door with the firewood axe and dragged the couch against it, her hands trembling as she gripped the hunting knife her father had left her. The wind howled, but it couldn't drown out the rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It stopped abruptly at 3:17 a.m. She knew because she'd been staring at the wind-up clock on the mantel, counting the seconds until it passed. Then came the knock. 3 slow taps on the front door. Tap, tap, tap. Not hard, not frantic, just calm, deliberate, like a neighbor stopping by for coffee. Mara froze, the knife slipping in her sweating palm. She didn't move, didn't breathe, until the silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. She crept to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to peek. The porch was empty. No figure, no shadow, just the undisturbed snow glowing faintly under the moon. But the prints were there again, circling tighter this time. The toes pointed inward, like they were staring at the cabin. By the third night, she hadn't slept. Her eyes burned, her head throbbed, and the radio sat like a dead thing on the counter. She'd stopped trying to rationalize it. The footsteps, the knocks, the prints. They weren't human, not entirely. She could feel it in the way the air thickened each night, the way the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch just beyond their natural shapes. She whispered prayers she hadn't said since childhood, clutching the knife as the clock ticked toward 3:17. This time it wasn't footsteps, it was a voice, low, garbled, like a throat clogged with mud. It seeped through the walls, not from outside, but from inside, from the radio. Mara, it rasped, drawing her name out like a slow bleed. She jolted upright, staring at the lifeless machine. Its dials were still, its power light dark, yet the voice crawled out again. Mara, come outside. The words buzzed and warped, layered with echoes that didn't match any language she knew. She grabbed the radio and hurled it against the wall, shattering its plastic shell. The voice stopped, but only for a moment. Then it came from the fireplace, the pipes, the floorboards. Come outside. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Because when dawn broke, weak and gray through the snow, she saw it. A single word scratched into the frost on every window, over and over, in jagged, trembling lines. Soon. The word soon glared at Mara from the frosted windows, its jagged edges deepening as the day wore on, as if scratched by unseen nails. She hadn't dared touch the glass, hadn't dared move from the center of the cabin where she sat wrapped in a tattered blanket, the hunting knife trembling in her grip. The broken radio lay in shards across the floor, its speaker cracked open like a wound. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling it was still watching her. The air inside grew colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that coated her tongue. She hadn't eaten since the last can of soup ran out, but hunger was the least of her fears now. She'd spent the day preparing. The firewood axe leaned against the couch, its blade sharpened on a whetstone she'd found in the shed months ago. She'd dragged the kitchen table to reinforce the door, piling every chair atop it until the barricade looked like a child's fort. Feeble, but all she had. The wind-up clock ticked relentlessly toward night, each second a hammer against her skull. She didn't pray anymore. The words felt hollow, drowned by the memory of that voice. "Come outside." As dusk fell, the cabin seemed to shrink. Shadows pooled in the corners, thicker than they should have been, and the creaking of the walls sounded less like settling timber and more like something breathing. Mara's eyes darted to the clock. 3:15 a.m., 2 minutes left. She tightened her grip on the knife, her breath shallow, waiting for the inevitable. At 3:17, the silence shattered, not with footsteps or knocks, but with a low, resonant hum. It vibrated up through the floorboards, rattling the table, the chairs, the axe. The barricade shuddered, then collapsed inward as the door burst open, splintering into fragments. Snow swirled inside, carried by a wind that howled with a voice of its own. "Mara!" She scrambled back, slashing wildly at the air, but there was no figure, no shape, just the storm rushing in like a living thing. Then she saw it, not outside but reflected in the blade of her knife, a silhouette framed in the doorway. Tall, impossibly thin, its arms dangling like twisted branches, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. She spun to face it, but the porch was empty. The reflection vanished. Her pulse thundered as the hum grew louder, now joined by a chorus of whispers. Her name over and over, from every direction. "Mara! You can't hide." The floor beneath her buckled, a crack splitting the wood from wall to wall. She stumbled, dropping the knife as she clawed at the couch for balance. The whispers turned to laughter, wet and guttural, echoing from the widening gap. A hand emerged, gray, skeletal, its fingers too long, gripping the edge of the split. Then another. Mara screamed, lunging for the axe, but the floor gave way entirely, plunging her into darkness. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs in a space that shouldn't exist. The air was damp, reeking of rot and iron, and the walls, if they were walls, pulsed faintly, slick with moisture. Above the cabin's floor was a jagged hole, its edges framed by the dim glow of moonlight. She staggered to her feet, hands empty, the axe and knife lost in the fall. The whispers surrounded her now, closer, intimate, brushing against her ears like damp breath. "You saw us!" A figure stepped from the shadows. No, it was the shadow, its form shifting, as if made of smoke and bone. Its face was a void, save for 2 pinpricks of light that burned into her. More shapes emerged behind it, indistinct but countless, their voices merging into a single deafening chant. "Join us!" Mara backed away, her hands scraping the slimy walls, searching for a way out. There was none. The figures closed in, their cold fingers brushing her arms, her neck, pulling her into their mass. She fought, kicking and clawing, but her strength faded as the chill sank into her bones. The last thing she felt was the void swallowing her scream. The last thing she saw those twin lights blinking out. Then nothing. Days later, the blizzard lifted. A hiker, drawn by the cabin's chimney smoke long extinguished, found it abandoned. The door hung off its hinges, the interior a wreck, furniture overturned, the floor split open to reveal a shallow crawl space, empty save for a rusted knife and a broken axe. No sign of Mara, no footprints leading away. Just a faint hum lingering in the air, too low to place, and a single word scratched into the cabin's every wall. "Here." The hiker left quickly, unsettled, never noticing the bare prints circling the cabin, nor the voice whispering his name from the wind as he fled. The hollow signal waited, patient and eternal, for its next call to be answered.